Somewhere in every single episode of SpongeBob, the man who created the whole show is hiding in plain sight. His own mouth sings the opening, placed on a pirate painting that somebody once found in a thrift store. Most people have watched it 1,000 times and never once known. That is only the beginning. This cheerful little cartoon about a sponge and a pineapple is stitched together from real science, a real and sorrowful piece of history, quiet, secret love stories, and even a few pieces its makers tried to erase. Underneath all the silliness, almost nothing is an accident. Tonight, slow and gentle, here are 10 hidden secrets buried in the friendliest show ever made. Each one completely true, each one easy to miss. By the end of it, the goofy yellow sponge you thought you knew will look entirely different. Welcome to Cartoonology. Let's get into it. The teacher behind the sponge. Long before the yellow sponge had a laugh the whole world would learn, there was a man standing near the ocean in front of a small group of children, trying to make them care about animals that most people never think about. His name was Steven Hillenburg, and in the 1980s, he was not a cartoon maker. He was a teacher. He worked at a sea science center in Dana Point, California, a place built to help everyday people understand the ocean a little better. School groups came in on field trips. Families came on weekends. Part of his job was to walk these visitors through the lives of the small, odd creatures that live in the spot where the sea meets the shore. He had real training for this. In college, he studied ocean life and earned a degree in it from a school called Humboldt State, up in the northern part of California. While he was there, he also kept up a second, smaller study on the side, art. As a boy, he had loved two things at once. He loved the sea, and he loved to draw. For years, those two loves lived in separate rooms. One became his work, the other stayed a quiet hobby, the kind of thing a person does in spare moments, without ever expecting it to grow into anything. The problem Hillenburg kept bumping into as a teacher was small but stubborn. The animals he most wanted to talk about were not the ones that make a child sit up straight. He was not teaching kids about sharks or whales. He was teaching them about the creatures that live in tide pools, the little puddles of seawater that get trapped among the rocks when the tide rolls out, and the shore is left bare for a few hours. A tide pool is its own tiny world, full of life, but it is the kind of world a person has to slow down and crouch over to notice. Snails, crabs, tiny worms, sea stars, and sponges. To a child standing on slippery rocks, a sponge might be the most boring thing in the whole ocean. It does not swim. It does not have a face. It just sits there and soaks. None of this love was new to him. The pull toward the ocean had been there since he was a child, long before any classroom or any paycheck entered the picture. The same was true of his drawing, a skill he had been quietly building since he was young. Most people are handed one clear talent and told to chase it down. Hillenburg had been carrying two of them for as long as he could remember, and for most of his life, the two simply refused to fit together. The sea was the serious thing, the drawing was the playful thing. The idea that the two might someday join into a single job had not yet occurred to anyone, and least of all, to him. So he reached for the one tool he had been carrying his whole life. He started to draw. Around the end of the 1980s, Hillenburg made a comic book to help him teach. He called it the Intertidal Zone. The name comes from the real word for that stretch of shore that spends part of the day underwater and part of the day out in the open air, the rocky in-between place where the tide pools form. The comic was never meant for stores or for fame. It was a classroom helper, a way to make a kid laugh at a sea worm long enough to actually remember a fact about it later. What made the comic work was a single choice that would shape everything that came after. Rather than drawing the sea animals the way they truly look, Hillenburg gave them faces, arms, and personalities. He drew sea creatures that walked and talked and joked the way people do. A crab could be grumpy, a snail could be shy. The real signs stayed true underneath all of it, but the animals on top became little characters a child could actually root for and remember. One of those characters was a sponge. In the comic, he went by the name Bob the Sponge, and his job was to guide readers through the pages, almost like a friendly host, showing visitors around a museum. This early Bob did not look much like the square fellow the world would meet years later. He was drawn to look like a real sea sponge, lumpy and rounded and natural, much closer to the actual thing found out on the rocks. The seed, though, was planted right there on those pages, a kind sponge leading the way, telling small jokes about the sea while teaching without making it feel like teaching. Hillenburg hoped to turn the comic into a real published book. He carried the Intertidal Zone around and tried to find someone willing to print it. No one wanted it. Publisher after publisher said no. The comic that would one day grow into one of the most loved shows in television history could not even find a home as a small science book for children. That string of rejections ended up pushing him towards something new. The more he worked, the more he felt pulled toward animation, toward the idea of making drawings that actually move. So he made a large and frightening choice. He stepped away from the teaching path he had spent years training for, and he went back to school again, this time to study animation at a California college well known for it. He was starting over from the bottom in a brand new field. He was trading a subject he had already mastered for one he was only beginning to understand, with no promise that any of it would work out. His new skills opened a door. He landed a job on a Nickelodeon cartoon called Rocko's Modern Life, a strange and funny show about a nervous little animal trying to get by in a goofy, oversized world. Working there taught Hillenburg how a cartoon really gets built. He learned how stories get shaped from rough ideas, how a joke gets timed so it lands at the right second, how a whole crew of artists turns loose sketches into something that plays on a screen and makes people laugh out loud. He was learning the craft from the inside, soaking it up the same way a sponge soaks up water. And the whole time, sitting quietly in the back of his mind, those old comic characters were waiting their turn. Looking back now, the size of his gamble is easy to admire. He had held a steady identity as a science teacher, a clear answer ready whenever anyone asked what he did. He set that answer down on purpose and walked straight into a field where he was a beginner all over again, often older than the students sitting around him, starting from the very bottom. The safe move would have been to stay put where he already knew the ground. He picked the harder road instead. The entire undersea world that millions of people would later grow up inside only exists because one man was willing to risk being a beginner twice. In the middle of the 1990s, Hillenburg began turning the sea creatures from the intertidal zone into a show of his very own. Bob the Sponge sat right at the center of the plan. The lumpy, natural sponge slowly changed shape in Hillenburg's hands. A square sponge, the kind a person might grab to scrub a kitchen sink, struck him as funnier and easier to love than a realistic ocean blob. So the character grew a flat, squared body, two large round eyes, a wide smile, and a neat pair of pants. The grumpy neighbor, the sweet best friend, the whole little ocean town began to take shape around him, piece by piece. On the first day of May in 1999, that ocean town finally swam onto televisions across the country. Getting to that day was neither quick nor simple. The show had to be pitched to a network, shaped, tested, and approved. A slow uphill climb that stretched across years of work after he first began building it in the middle of the decade. The very first episode was called Help Wanted, and it aired right after that year's big Kids' Choice Awards on Nickelodeon, a loud and crowded night that handed the brand new sponge a large audience, already gathered and watching for his very first swim onto the screen. A yellow square sponge climbed up out of an old teaching comic and into millions of homes, and on the surface, almost nothing about him looked like the quiet science lesson he had started life as. The science lesson, though, was still in there. It was folded under the jokes, tucked into the corners, waiting patiently for anyone curious enough to look closely. The clearest proof that Hillenburg never forgot where his sponge came from is hidden right inside the show, sitting in places most people glide straight past without a second glance. The intertidal zone, that old comic no publisher wanted, left its fingerprints all over the cartoon. On the final page of the comic, there is a small drawing of a life preserver, the round float that gets tossed to someone struggling in the water, and printed across it are the words, "The Intertidal Zone." Years later, that very same shape and style turned up again as the sign that welcomes everyone to the town in the show. A tiny float from a rejected classroom comic quietly became part of the welcome sign of the most famous underwater town ever drawn. Almost no one watching would ever guess that the sign carried a piece of the show's secret history. There is another gentle nod hiding in open view. In one episode, a mug rests on a desk that belongs to the pink starfish character, and painted on the side of that mug is a sea star drawn in the very same style as the one on the cover of the old comic. A small piece of the intertidal zone sitting on a table inside the show it grew into. Easy to miss unless a person already knows the whole story behind it. These little touches matter because of what they reveal about the man behind the cartoon. The show could have buried its beginnings completely and no one would have blamed it. A silly comedy about a sponge in square pants does not need to remember that it once began as a science teacher's homemade handout for kids on a field trip. Yet Hillenburg kept slipping pieces of that beginning back into the work again and again, like a person leaving small notes around a house for whoever cares enough to find them. For a very long time, almost no one could read those notes. The original Intertidal Zone comic stayed mostly out of sight, locked away from the public eye. A few pages would surface here and there over the years, shown briefly likely in an interview or a behind-the-scenes feature, but the full comic was hard to track down. Only fairly recently did the early pages become widely available for fans to actually see with their own eyes. After decades, people could finally hold the rough first draft of a world they had thought they already knew by heart and spot for themselves the sponge that started it all. What sits underneath this whole story is a simple, almost tender truth about the show. SpongeBob SquarePants started in the smallest and most ordinary way a thing can start. It began as a teacher trying to make children care about a dull little animal stuck to a rock. Every wild joke, every strange creature, every odd back alley of the town can be traced straight back to a person who loved the ocean so deeply that he spent his free hours drawing it for kids who might never have learned to love it on their own. That root explains a great deal about why the show feels the way it feels. The ocean inside the cartoon is silly, but it is never sloppy. The animals act like goofy people, and yet they quietly keep small, true habits pulled from their real lives in the sea. A man who had studied the ocean for years simply could not help letting real knowledge leak into his made-up town, even when his only goal in a scene was to make a kid laugh. The care was baked in from the very first page of a comic that nobody wanted to publish. It also helps explain the warmth that so many people feel toward the show without ever quite being able to say why. There is a real difference between something built only to grab attention and something built out of honest love for its subject. The sponge was built out of love, dreamed up by a person who had stood on cold, wet rocks, pointed down into tide pools, and wished with his whole heart that the children in front of him would see the same wonder he saw. A person can feel this even without knowing a single fact about the man who made it. The town runs on jokes, yet the jokes keep brushing up against real things from the actual sea, almost out of reflex. Creatures behave in ways that quietly match how their real cousins behave in the water. Small details line up with how the ocean truly works, and not because the show is trying to slip in a lesson anymore. They line up because the person drawing it knew the sea far too well to ever draw it carelessly. The teaching had stopped being the goal a long time ago. The knowledge simply stayed in his hands and kept coming out on its own, year after year. That single starting point, one teacher with a homemade comic and the dream of making the dull seem wonderful, turns out to be the key that quietly unlocks nearly every secret the show is holding. Once it becomes clear that the cartoon grew out of real science and real care, the hidden jokes scattered through it stop looking like accidents. They begin to look like little gifts left behind on purpose by someone who hoped a curious person might one day come along and notice. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And the very first gift was tucked into the simplest place of all. It was hiding inside the name. Because the sponge the whole world now calls SpongeBob very nearly went by something completely different. And the real reason his name changed is a small puzzle that left fans guessing and believing the wrong answer for years. Section 2. The name that almost wasn't. By the late 1990s, the sponge was no longer just a stack of drawings tucked inside a desk drawer. He was becoming real. Hillenburg had a network behind him, a small team forming around him, and a plan taking shape on paper. The little ocean town had a look. The square character had a body, a face, and a pair of pants. A first test episode was being put together, the kind of early sample a network watches to decide whether a show is worth the money and the risk. And the star of that sample already had a name. That name was not the one the whole world ended up learning. Before he was SpongeBob, the character was called Sponge Boy. This was not a quick idea that lasted an afternoon and got tossed out. Sponge Boy was the real plan for a long stretch of time. The early papers that Hillenburg and his team put together to sell the show to the network, the pages of writing and artwork that explained what the cartoon would be, were built around a character named Sponge Boy. Those pages were made across the mid-1990s, and the name stuck through draft after draft. The planned title of the whole show was not even close to the one fans know today. The show was going to be called Sponge Boy Ahoy. The name went so deep into the project that the actors actually used it. When the very first test episode was recorded, the people giving their voices to the characters said Sponge Boy out loud, because that was simply who the character was at the time. For everyone working on the show, the yellow sponge in the kitchen was Sponge Boy, full stop. The name, now repeated by everyone, had not yet arrived. A lot of this can be seen today because the early planning materials survived. When someone wants to sell a show to a network, they put together a kind of guidebook for it, a bundle of drawings and notes that lays out who the characters are, what the world looks like, and why the whole thing is worth making. Hillenburg made one of these for his ocean show, and the pages inside it were created across the middle of the 1990s. Flipping through them, the same name shows up again and again. Not SpongeBob, SpongeBoy. The art looks familiar and strange at the same time, like running into an old friend who has aged in a slightly different direction than expected. Changing a name in the middle of building a show is not a tidy task. By the time the Clash was found, real work had already been done under the old name. A test episode had been voiced with SpongeBoy in it. Notes, sketches, and plans all carried the word. Swapping it out meant going back through that work and lifting the old name out wherever it had taken root, then settling the new one into its place. The change was small to say out loud, and the real chore to actually carry through. Then a problem appeared, and it was the kind of problem that has nothing to do with art and everything to do with paperwork. A name is not always free to use. When a company makes a product or a character, it can lock down the name so that no one else can use it for similar things. This is meant to stop copycats and confusion. When the people in charge of the legal side at Nickelodeon took a careful look, they found that the name SpongeBoy was already spoken for. Someone else had a claim on it. Using it could mean trouble down the road, the kind of trouble that ends in arguments and lawyers. So the name had to go. After all that time, the character at the center of the entire show suddenly needed a brand new name. The simplest way to see this is to imagine two shops on the same street trying to hang the exact same sign. The law steps in to keep them apart so that a customer does not wander into the wrong place by mistake. Names work the same way for products and characters. Once someone has properly claimed a name for a certain kind of thing, that name gets fenced off, and anyone who shows up later has to pick something new. The cartoon was the latecomer here. No matter how much work had already gone into SpongeBoy, the fence was up, and the only real path forward was to find a fresh name and keep going. Here is where one of the most repeated SpongeBob facts of all time comes in, and it happens to be wrong. Ask almost any fan why the name changed, and the answer comes back fast and confident: a mop. The story goes that there was already a cleaning mop on the market called SpongeBoy, and that this mop forced the cartoon to change course. This explanation has been passed around for years. It shows up in videos, in posts, in casual conversations. It sounds neat and tidy. A cleaning product about a sponge blocking a cartoon about a sponge feels almost too perfect. The trouble is that the mop never turned up. People went looking. Fans who wanted to find this famous mop spent a shocking amount of time digging through old records trying to prove it was real. They came up empty. There is no sign of a registered cleaning mop called SpongeBoy from that time. Even one of the show's own crew, when asked about it, could only say that it was a mop or something, which is the sort of half memory that spreads easily and gets repeated as solid truth. The search for the real SpongeBoy mop stretched on for years and ended with the same result every single time. The mop, by every account anyone could find, did not exist. So what actually blocked the name? The most likely answer points somewhere far less exciting than a rival mop. The clash seems to have come from an art product, possibly a pencil item, that already carried the name. On top of that, there was a comic book character named SpongeBoy floating around in a different series years earlier, which only added to the tangle. None of it is as fun as the mop legend. None of it makes for as clean a story, but the plain truth tends to be messier than the myth. And in this case, the myth simply won the popularity contest, while the real reason sat quietly in the background. With SpongeBoy off the table, Hillenburg had to solve the puzzle in a hurry, and he had one firm rule he refused to break. The new name had to keep the word sponge inside it. There was a real worry behind that rule. A yellow square with holes in it does not automatically read as a sponge. Looked at the wrong way, a yellow square block could easily be taken for something else, like a slice or a chunk of cheese. Hillenburg did not want kids glancing at the screen and thinking the hero was a walking piece of cheese. Keeping the word sponge in the name was a way of telling every single viewer right away exactly what they were looking at. The name itself would do part of the job of explaining the character, so he kept the sponge and changed the boy. The character became SpongeBob. Then came a last name, the part that makes the whole thing sing: SquarePants. Put together, the name describes the character almost completely. It tells anyone he is a sponge, it gives him a friendly first name, and it points right at his most famous feature, those crisp, square pants. A child can hear the name once and picture the character instantly, and there is a quiet bit of history folded into that choice, a thread that reaches all the way back to the very beginning. In the old teaching comic from years before, the sponge character was already named Bob the Sponge. So when Hillenburg landed on SpongeBob, he was not pulling a random name out of thin air. He was circling back to a name that had been part of this creature since its very first appearance on those classroom pages. The boy in SpongeBoy had to go. The Bob had been there all along, waiting. The two versions of the character, SpongeBoy and SpongeBob, were close cousins, though they were not exactly the same. Side by side, small differences show up. The early SpongeBoy wore a hat, a colorful little cap that the final character left behind. His shoes were shaped a bit differently, longer and more pointed. His face carried a slightly goofier look. Even the little holes dotted across his body, the holes that make him look like a real sponge, were not quite the same in number. The character the world fell in love with was a cleaned up, simplified, slightly softened version of the fellow who started out as SpongeBoy. These changes were not random. Each small fix nudged the design towards something easier to draw thousands of times and easier to recognize in a single glance. A hat is one more thing for an artist to track in every frame. Pointed shoes pull the eye downward and away from the face. Smoothing those away let the character's wide, open expression do all the talking, which is exactly what a comedy built on big, bouncy reactions needs. Trimming the busy details turned a crowded design into one that reads clearly, even from across a room. What makes this whole story worth telling is not only the name change itself, it is the way the wrong explanation took over so completely. Think about how strange that is. There is a true story here, sitting right out in the open, about a legal snag and a careful fix, and a thoughtful rule about keeping the word sponge. And yet, the version most people carry around in their heads is the mop, a detail that does not hold up the moment anyone checks it. The mop won because it is a better story, not because it is a true one. It is short, it is funny, it connects two cleaning things in a way the brain enjoys. Truth often loses races like this, because the messy, real answer rarely travels as fast as the clean, fake one. That gap between the easy story and the real one runs through so much of how facts spread, and the sponge sits right in the middle of a perfect example. A made-up reason got repeated so many times that it started to feel like common knowledge. People who would never lie about it passed it along in good faith, sure they were sharing something true, and the actual reason, the boring, legal one, kept getting left out because nobody chooses the dull version when a shinier one is sitting right there. It is a small reminder to check the neat stories, even the harmless ones, since a fact can be repeated 1,000 times and still be hollow at the center. The funny part is that the real story turns out to be the better one once a person actually sits with it. A mop is a dead end. It explains the change, and then there is nowhere left to go. The true version opens up into something richer, a creator with a strict rule about being clear, a last-second scramble, a name that loops back to a comic from years before, and a whole world that came within an inch of carrying a different title. The honest answer rewards curiosity. The myth just closes the book. There's also something telling in how much care went into the fix. A rushed team under pressure could have slapped any name onto the character and moved on. Plenty of shows do exactly that. Hillenburg held a clear rule instead. The sponge had to stay, because he understood that a name is the first thing a viewer meets. He treated the name as part of the storytelling, not as a label stuck on at the last second. The same careful hand that hid pieces of an old comic inside the show was at work here too, making sure that even the title told the truth about what the character really was. The name itself became a small, hidden first joke. It is also a small lesson in how close famous things come to being completely different. For a long stretch, the plan was a show called SpongeBoy Ahoy, starring a hatted little sponge named SpongeBoy. If that one legal claim had never existed, the whole world might be repeating a different name today, singing a different theme, drawing a different character on their notebooks. The version everyone knows feels permanent and obvious, as if it could never have been anything else. The story underneath shows how easily it could have gone another way, and how a single piece of paperwork quietly steered the entire thing. By the time the change was made, the new name fit so well that it became impossible to imagine the old one. SpongeBob SquarePants rolls off the tongue. It rhymes with itself in a soft, bouncy way. It sticks in the memory after a single hearing. The name that almost never happened ended up being one of the most recognizable in the history of cartoons, while SpongeBoy faded into a footnote that only the most curious fans ever go hunting for. The hatted sponge named SpongeBoy still lives on, in a way, in the old papers and early art that fans dig up and study. He is a window into a version of the show that almost was. A reminder that the cartoon, sitting frozen in everyone's memory, was once soft clay, changing shape right up until the last moment. Every famous thing has a draft like this hiding behind it, a slightly different version that came close to being the real one. The name, though, is only the first secret hiding in plain sight. It is a small one, a mix-up over a mop and a quiet fix. The character got a new name and the show moved on, and most people never thought twice about it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The town those characters live in is a different matter. Its name sounds just as silly and harmless as everything else in the show. A goofy little joke that fits a goofy little world. But that name points at a real place on the map, a real piece of history, and a true story so heavy and so sad that it sits oddly underneath a children's cartoon. The Sponge's name hid a small mistake. The town's name hides something far darker. Section 3. The real place at the bottom of the sea. Bikini Bottom. The name fits the show like a glove. It is bouncy and a little bit silly, the kind of name that makes a kid grin before anything has even happened on the screen. It sounds completely made up, the way a cartoon town should. A happy little place at the bottom of the ocean, where a sponge flips burgers and a starfish naps under a rock, deserves a name that feels light as a bubble. The name is real though, at least half of it is. Bikini is not a word someone dreamed up for a children's show. It is the name of an actual place on the actual map, far out in the Pacific Ocean, and the true story tied to that place is one of the heaviest and saddest of the last 100 years. The link between the cartoon town and the real place is not a guess or a wild idea cooked up by fans late at night. The man who gives SpongeBob his voice, Tom Kenny, said it out loud in an interview. The town is named after a real spot called Bikini Atoll. An atoll is a ring of low islands and reef that wraps around a calm pool of water in the middle, the worn-down rim of an ancient volcano that has slowly sunk back into the sea. Bikini Atoll sits in a scattered group of islands in the Pacific called the Marshall Islands, roughly halfway between Hawaii and Papua New Guinea, above the line that runs around the middle of the planet. There is even a small twist hiding in the spelling. The name Bikini is a flattened English version of the island's own name, Bikini. Outsiders heard the word, reshaped it to fit their own mouths, and the simpler spelling stuck. So the cheerful word, printed across a cartoon sign, is itself a slightly worn-down copy of a name the islanders had given their home long before any of the rest of this began. So the name carries a small map joke inside it. When the show places its town at the bottom of the sea and calls it Bikini Bottom, it is setting that town right underneath that real ring of islands. The town is, quite literally, the bottom of Bikini. A clever little play on a real location, hiding in a name most people never think twice about. The word even spread into clothing. The kind of swimsuit called a bikini got its name from this very same place. Around the time the events on the islands were filling newspapers, a clothing maker gave his small new swimsuit that name, hoping it would land with as much shock as the news coming off those distant shores. So the goofy word in a cartoon town and the everyday word for a swimsuit both trace back to the same lonely ring of reef out in the Pacific. One place, quietly stamped on two corners of the world, most people would never connect. This is the point where the story stops being light and it is worth slowing down for. After the Second World War ended, the United States took control over a large stretch of the Pacific, including the Marshall Islands and the people who lived there. The world had just seen what these new and terrible weapons could do, and the United States wanted to keep building and testing them. Doing that takes space, lots of empty space, far away from big cities. Bikini Atoll, small and remote and surrounded by open ocean, was chosen as one of the testing grounds. Real people lived on Bikini. About 167 of them called the atoll home. Families who had fished its waters and lived on its land for generations. In 1946, those people were gathered up and moved off their islands. They were told it was needed, that it would help bring an end to all wars, and that one day they might be able to come back. They agreed, packed up their lives, and were carried away to another island called Rongerik. That new island could not feed them. The food they needed simply was not there, and the people who had given up their home to help the world ended up facing hunger on the island they were handed in return. The way it was framed mattered a great deal. The people were approached almost as though they were being asked to make a gift to the whole world, a sacrifice that might help bring an end to fighting everywhere for good. Faced with a request like that, they said yes. It is a hard thing to refuse when the ask comes wrapped in the promise of peace and the promise of one day coming home. Both of those promises turned out to be far emptier than they sounded on the day they were made. What happened on Bikini after they left was enormous. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States set off a long string of nuclear tests on and around the atoll, around 23 of them in all. These were not small. One test in 1954, known by the name Bravo, was so powerful that its blast was something like 1,000 times the size of the bomb dropped on the city of Hiroshima. A single explosion on a tiny ring of islands, carrying the force of 1,000 of the worst weapons the world had ever known up to that point. The blast was so large that it reshaped the very ground it struck, erasing pieces of the reef as though they had never been there at all, and leaving a deep wound carved into the seabed. Bikini was not the only place used this way. The testing spread across more than one atoll in the region, and across the wider chain of islands, the number of weapons set off climbed far beyond what landed on Bikini alone. Some of the tests were done up in the air. Some were set off on the ground. At least one was triggered underwater, throwing a towering wall of sea spray into the sky in a shape that cameras captured and that the world would never forget. For more than 10 years, this remote and once quiet corner of the Pacific became one of the most blasted patches of land and water anywhere on the planet. The damage did not pack up and leave when the tests ended. The blasts left the land and water soaked with invisible poison, the kind that lingers for an unimaginably long time. The people of Bikini could not simply return home. Their islands had been made unsafe in a way that does not fade in a year, or a lifetime, or even 100 lifetimes. The kind of poison left behind is expected to stay dangerous for thousands of years. A home that had been theirs for generations was taken out of reach, not for a season, but for longer than all of recorded history stretched backward. There was one heartbreaking attempt to fix it. In the 1970s, a couple hundred of the Bikini people were brought back to their home islands, the place their families had longed for. They lived there for a while. Then, in 1978, doctors discovered that their bodies had taken in dangerous amounts of the leftover poison from the soil and the food, more than had ever been measured in any group of people anywhere, so they had to leave again. Twice now, the people of Bikini had been pulled away from the only home they truly belonged to. The second time, by the slow harm soaked into the ground beneath their feet. Even now, long after the explosion stopped, the story has no happy ending waiting at the close. The people of Bikini, along with their children and their children's children, remain scattered, living on other islands and in other countries, carrying the memory of a homeland they cannot return to. A whole community was turned into wanderers, not because they had done a single thing wrong, but because their small ring of islands had been judged useful for something far larger and far colder than their ordinary lives. That is the real Bikini, a beautiful ring of islands, emptied of its families, scarred by some of the largest explosions ever made by human hands, and left behind as a place its own people cannot safely touch. Now hold that next to the cartoon, a bright, cheerful town full of laughing fish sitting at the bottom of the sea, named after one of the most damaged places on Earth. The gap between those two things is almost too wide to take in. The sunniest show on television borrowed its setting from a story soaked in loss. For a long time, fans turned this over in their heads and started to wonder if the connection went deeper than just the name. A quiet theory took shape online. It went like this. Maybe the strange, talking, brightly colored sea creatures of Bikini Bottom are the way they are because of the testing. Maybe the cartoon is, in a hidden way, a picture of what those waters became after the blasts. It was the kind of idea that sounds too dark to be real, the sort of thing fans argue about for fun without ever expecting an answer. For years, it stayed just a theory, and some of the people who made the show even waved it off. The cast did not all agree on it. The very person who had confirmed where the name came from had also, at one point, pushed back on the darker idea, telling people that the talking sea creatures were never meant to be the result of any testing. For a while, his word seemed to settle the matter. The town had taken the name, the thinking went, and the heavy history had stayed outside the show's walls. It was filed away as a fan story that had drifted a little too far from the truth. Then it got confirmed, and by someone who would know. During a conversation with the show's main cast, the actor who voices Squidward brought up the old theory, saying he had always liked the idea that the whole thing was tied to the atomic testing at Bikini. A writer on the show, the same man who voices Plankton and has helped shape the series for years, answered him directly. He said the theory was true, absolutely true. He explained that this had been part of the fun of it from early on, a question the team had quietly played with of how far they could push the idea. He even went further, describing an early plan where the world above the water had been wiped out, leaving the undersea town behind in the aftermath. The actor who had spent years telling people the theory was false was sitting right there, surprised to learn he had been wrong the whole time. The full, dark version did not survive into the show everyone knows. That heavier idea, the wiped out world above, was set aside very early while the first season was still being shaped. The cartoon grew into the warm and silly place it became, and the grim origin faded into the background. But the seed of it, the choice to name this underwater world after that particular place stayed right where it had always been, sitting in plain sight at the heart of the show. Once that lands, the silliness of the name takes on a strange new weight. Bikini Bottom is not only a goofy play on words, it is a small, permanent marker pointing back at a real place and a real wrong, tucked into the most unlikely show imaginable. A person could watch the cartoon for an entire childhood and never feel the shadow underneath the name. The shadow is still there, all the same. There's even a quiet acknowledgement of all this from people who study the real history. Researchers who work on the story of Bikini Atoll have pointed out that small pieces of that history do brush up against the cartoon now and then, in ways most viewers would never catch. The connection runs in both directions. The show carries a memory of the place, and the place, through the show, keeps drifting back into millions of minds that have no idea they are holding it. There is something quietly staggering in the scale of it. The name has been printed on lunchboxes and backpacks, sung in the theme, shouted across playgrounds, and typed into search bars an uncountable number of times. A word born out of one of the darkest chapters of the last century has somehow become one of the most cheerful sounds in the world, repeated by children who will never know what it once carried. The memory of the place rides along inside all that joy, unnoticed, handed from one generation to the next, without a single word of explanation. What makes this the heaviest secret in the whole show is the way it sits so gently on the surface. The name of the town hid a small mistake in the last section, a mix-up over a sponge and a missing mop, the kind of error that harms no one and makes for a fun story. The name of the town in this section hides something else entirely, a true history of families forced from their home and a place broken for thousands of years. The same show holds both, a light secret and a dark one, side by side, with the same cheerful music playing over each. That is the strange power of a cartoon built by someone who cared about the real sea. It can carry the actual weight of the ocean's history without ever stopping to explain it, letting the silliness ride on top while the truth waits quietly underneath for anyone willing to look. The wonder and the sorrow of the real world both made it into the show, folded so softly into a single bouncy name that most people carry the heavier half around without ever knowing it is there. A child hears the music and a funny town, while the history waits underneath, asking nothing, patient enough to remain. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The town's name reaches all the way back to a real place. The next secret reaches all the way back to a real person, and it is sitting at the very start of every single episode, in the first few seconds, before the story has even begun. Each time the show opens, a singing pirate appears on the screen, and hidden inside that pirate is a piece of the man who made the whole thing, left there on purpose and easy to miss. Section 4. The creator hiding in the opening. Every episode of SpongeBob begins the very same way. Before the sponge shows up, before the town, before a single joke lands, a deep and salty voice calls out across the screen and asks if everyone is ready. A chorus of children shouts an answer back, and there, painted on what looks like an old picture in a frame, is a pirate. He has a wide hat, a curly head of hair, a patch over one eye, and a green parrot perched on his shoulder. He opens his mouth and starts to sing the song that millions of people know by heart, trading lines back and forth with the kids the whole way through. That pirate has a name. Fans came to call him Painty the Pirate. For the entire length of the series, every single time the show begins, he is the first face on the screen, leading the little tune that kicks the whole thing into motion. Most people sing right along with him and never stop to wonder who he is or where he came from. From the very first episode back in 1999, this opening has played out the same way, barely changed across hundreds of episodes and many years. The little song grew into one of the most recognized tunes anywhere in the world, the kind almost anyone can hum after hearing it a single time. Begin the question about who lives in a pineapple under the sea, and a whole room of people will finish the line on instinct. That is how deeply the opening has sunk into the memory of nearly everyone who has ever owned a television. Look closely at the pirate though, and something is a little bit off. The rest of him is a flat, still painting, the kind of thing that might hang on a wall in somebody's old house and gather dust. His mouth, however, moves. It is not drawn or animated the way the rest of him is. It is a real, living mouth, filmed on a real person and laid over the painting so that the painting appears to be singing. The result is strange and oddly charming, a stiff, painted pirate with a pair of real human lips doing all the work. The trick of placing a real moving mouth onto a still picture was not brand new. Older cartoons and television bits had played with the same idea years before. filming an actor's lips and dropping them onto a frozen face. The show borrowed that old technique and used it for the one figure who opens every episode. The choice gives the pirate a slightly homemade, slightly spooky feel, a little rough around the edges, in a way that fits a show that never took itself too seriously. The painting itself was never made for the show at all. It was a random piece of art that someone on the crew came across in a thrift store, one of those second-hand shops packed with cast-off odds and ends, where the pirate was sitting cheap and waiting for any buyer at all. Someone liked it, brought it in, and turned it into the face that opens what would become the most successful cartoon the network ever aired. A forgotten painting from a bargain bin became the front door to an entire underwater world. There is a real charm in the fact that the face was found instead of made. A show with this much money behind it could have hired an artist to paint a perfect pirate, polished and exact and built to order. Instead, the opening kept a secondhand stranger, a painting carrying its own little history that no one will ever fully know. Who painted it? Who owned it? How it ended up in that shop? That small mystery rides along quietly in every episode, an unsolved story sitting right at the very front of the most watched cartoon around. The pirate is not stuck only in the opening either. The very same painted face turns up inside a handful of episodes here and there, hanging on a wall somewhere in the background, a quiet little nod to the figure who greets everyone at the start. He is a small fixed point in the world of the show, almost always there, always watching from inside his frame. Here's the part that turns the whole thing from a clever trick into something far more personal. The mouth on that pirate belongs to a real and specific person, and that person is Steven Hillenburg, the man who created the show. His lips, filmed up close, are the lips that move on the pirate at the start of every single episode. The singing voice itself comes from a different performer, a man named Patrick Pinney, who gives the pirate that rough, cheerful, slightly lisping sailor sound. So the voice and the moving mouth actually come from two separate people, working together to bring one painted pirate to life. The voice belongs to Pinney. The mouth, the part that moves on the screen, is all Hillenburg. This was not common knowledge for a very long time. It sat quietly inside the show for years, a secret hidden so well that most fans had no reason to even suspect it was there. It lived in the special features on a couple of the show's home video releases, the kind of bonus material only a truly dedicated fan would ever dig through. Then, in 2019, the people who make the show said it out loud in front of a huge crowd at a large fan gathering, and the secret finally reached the wider world. The timing of that reveal gives it a real and lasting weight. Steven Hillenburg had passed away the year before, in 2018, after a long and serious illness, one that slowly takes away the body's ability to move. It was a cruel thing to strike a man whose whole life had been built on his hands and his eyes. He kept a quiet watch over the show for as long as he was able. So when the cast stood up and told a room full of fans that the pirate's mouth had belonged to their creator all along, they were sharing something tender. The man who made SpongeBob was gone, and yet he was still right there at the opening of every episode, singing along in his own quiet way. The reveal felt less like a fun fact and more like a gift, passed from the people who knew him to the people who loved what he made. He had folded a piece of himself so deeply into the show that he would keep appearing in it forever, long after he was no longer around to take a bow. And because the show keeps running, that count only grows. New episodes still open with the same pirate, which means the creator's mouth keeps turning up in episodes he never lived to see, singing the same line he helped write, on and on into the years ahead. The song that pirate sings carries its own small history too. The tune is borrowed from an old sailor song called Blow the Man Down. Songs like that one, sometimes called sea shanties, were the work songs of people on ships in the old days. Sailors sang them to keep a steady rhythm while hauling heavy ropes and doing hard, tiring labor out on the open water. Many shanties were built as a back and forth, one voice calling out a line and the rest of the crew answering it, which is the very same shape the show's theme takes, with the pirate calling and the children answering. Pulling the tune from one of those old songs quietly ties the whole opening back to the real sea and to the long line of people who once lived and worked on it. A song from the actual ocean got handed to a cartoon ocean, and the thread between the two stayed unbroken. Even the little splash of real water in the opening has a story hiding behind it. After the pirate finishes, the opening shows a quick flash of real waves, actual filmed water, just before the view dives down into the painted, animated world waiting below. That real water was filmed in a swimming pool, and the pool belonged to another animator, a friend working in the same business named Gendy Tartakovsky, who went on to make several famous cartoons versions of his own. So the opening turns out to be stitched together from borrowed and personal pieces: a thrift store painting, a friend's backyard pool, an old sailor work song, and the creator's own mouth. All of it layered into a handful of short seconds that play before every single episode, most of them passing by far too fast for anyone to notice. There is something gentle and humble in the whole arrangement. A person who makes a giant hit show could choose to put his name up in lights. He could stand front and center, take interviews, and make certain that everyone understood exactly how important he was to the thing they loved. Hillenburg did close to the opposite. He tucked himself into the smallest, sneakiest spot he could find, a pair of moving lips on a second-hand pirate painting, and then he said almost nothing about it for years and years. The signature was sitting there the entire time, in full view, and almost no one knew to look. Artists have always done small versions of this. A painter might tuck a tiny picture of his own face into the corner of a crowded scene, or hide a single letter from his name in the folds of a curtain. It is a way of whispering that a real person once stood here and made this thing without ever shouting it. Hillenburg's version was bolder and stranger than most, because what he hid was not a secret symbol or a tiny initial, but his actual face, or at least the moving part of it, placed right at the front of every episode. The boldest hiding spot of all turned out to be the most obvious one in the room. There is even a second layer of pirate woven into the show. The actor who voices SpongeBob also dresses up and plays a completely different live-action pirate, a separate character all his own, in some of the show's special episodes. The pirate idea runs all the way through the series, from the painted face in the opening to the people who make it behind the scenes, threaded in so thoroughly that it almost stops feeling like a theme and starts feeling like part of the show's own blood. The way it plays each time becomes quietly touching once the secret is known. The pirate calls out, the children's voices answer him, and the song rolls forward into the show. Every person who has ever sung along with that opening has, without having any idea, been singing right alongside the creator himself, his own mouth moving there on the screen the whole time. Years upon years of kids shouting the words on couches and in classrooms and on long car rides, every one of them unknowingly joined by the very man who dreamed the entire thing into being. All of this fits a pattern that has been building since the very first section of the story. The creator who slipped pieces of an old teaching comic into the cartoon, the one who held firm on a name that quietly told the truth about his character, was exactly the same kind of person who would hide his own face inside the opening and then keep it a secret. Over and over, the show turns out to be packed with small, private touches, left behind by someone who cared enough to tuck real meaning into corners most people would never bother to check. The opening is simply the most personal of all of them. On the surface, that opening is only a goofy pirate and a catchy song, the few seconds some people skip past to get straight to the episode. Underneath, it holds the creator's own mouth, a borrowed sailor song carried down through centuries, a friend's swimming pool, and a painting rescued from a pile of forgotten things. The same trick that runs through the entire show runs through its first few seconds, a bright and simple top layer with something far richer waiting just below the shine. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The secrets, though, are not only in the names and the openings and the quiet history tucked behind the scenes. Some of them are hiding in the characters themselves, built right into their very bodies, sitting in plain sight in every episode for anyone who happens to look the right way. One of the most familiar faces in the entire show, a grumpy neighbor that everyone is sure they know inside and out, is not even the kind of animal that nearly every single viewer has always assumed him to be. Section 5. The neighbor who is not a squid. Squidward Tentacles is one of the most familiar faces in the whole show. He lives in the house squeezed right between SpongeBob and Patrick, and he has been there since the very first episode. He plays the clarinet badly. He paints pictures of himself. He works a job he cannot stand, taking orders at the front counter of the Krusty Krab while dreaming of a grander life he believes he deserves. He is grumpy, tired, and easily annoyed, mostly by the two cheerful neighbors who simply will not leave him alone. Almost everyone who grew up with the show knows Squidward, and almost everyone who knows Squidward believes one thing about him that turns out to be wrong. The belief is sitting right there in his name, Squidward. The word squid is built into it, plain as day, so for years, viewers have looked at him and quietly filed him away as the squid of the group. He is not a squid. Squidward is an octopus. This is not a guess or a clever fan idea passed around online. The creator of the show said so himself, out loud and on the record, on a special feature made for the SpongeBob movie. He introduced the character as Squidward the Octopus, and then explained exactly why he had chosen that animal for this particular character. The reason is one of the best small jokes in the entire design of the show. Hillenburg picked an octopus because of its head. An octopus has a big, round, bulging head, far larger in proportion than the rest of its body, and Squidward, in his own mind, is a great artist, a brilliant musician, a refined and clever soul, trapped in a town full of fools. He is certain he is smarter than everyone around him, so Hillenburg gave him a body to match that swollen self-image. A character who believes he has an enormous brain got an enormous head to carry it in. The design is a quiet joke about his ego, hiding in plain sight in every single scene he appears in. It is worth sitting with how neatly that fits. Squidward spends his days certain that the world has failed to notice his greatness. He believes his music is beautiful, his paintings are masterpieces, and his taste is finer than anyone else's in town. Almost none of that is ever shown to be true, yet he carries himself like a genius, nose in the air, looking down on the cheerful mess around him. Handing a character like that the biggest head in the room is a joke that never stops working, because it is playing every second he is on the screen, whether the writers point at it or not. Then there's the matter of his legs. A real octopus has 8 arms. Squidward has 6. Anyone who stops to count his limbs will come up too short. The reason is wonderfully ordinary. Drawing 8 wiggling limbs on a character over and over across thousands of scenes is a lot of extra work for the artists. 6 was simpler, so the team quietly dropped 2 of his arms to make him easier to draw, and almost no one ever noticed the missing pair. There is even a small true touch in how he moves. The arms of an octopus are lined with suction cups, the little round grippers that let the real animal cling to rocks and shells. Squidward has them too, dotting the undersides of his legs, and in many scenes, his steps come with a soft, squelching, sticking sound, as if those cups are pulling at the floor with every stride. His 6 legs are usually arranged with a couple in front and the rest tucked close behind, so that he seems to glide more than walk. The body language is octopus all the way down, even while the name keeps insisting otherwise. There are only 2 moments in the whole long history of the show where Squidward appears with a full set of 8. One is a live-action stretch in an episode from the 2nd season, a brief patch where the show steps out of its cartoon look entirely. The other is a quick appearance many seasons later, deep into the show's run. Both are blink and miss them moments. In every other scene, across hundreds of episodes and many years, he walks around on 6, an octopus, quietly missing 2 arms that hardly anyone has ever stopped to count. So why call an octopus Squidward at all? The answer comes back to how close the 2 animals really are. Squids and octopuses are cousins, both soft-bodied sea creatures with many arms and no bones inside them. Hillenburg leaned on the squid for the name because it was close enough, and because of the way the word sounded. According to the actor who gives Squidward his voice, the more correct name would have been something like Octoward, and that simply did not sound right. Octoward is clumsy in the mouth. Squidward rolls off the tongue. So the octopus ended up wearing a squid's name, all for the sake of a better sound. There is a little extra charm in the name once it is broken apart. The ending, Ward, makes it sound like a regular human name, the sort of stuffy older man might really have, close to a name like Edward. The character is a fussy fellow who aches to be taken seriously, and a slightly old-fashioned, formal-sounding name fits him like a glove. His rival in the show, a richer and even snootier version of the same kind of creature, carries a name built the very same way, a fancy-sounding human name stretched over a sea animal. The 2 of them, locked in a lifelong contest over who is the greater artist, are a matched pair right down to how they were named. Even the show's rivalries were shaped with this same careful, layered hand. Octopuses are also famous for squirting ink to escape danger, and Hillenburg actually thought about giving Squidward that very ability. In the real ocean, the ink is a clever trick of survival. A frightened octopus fires out a dark cloud, turning the water murky for a moment, and slips away under the cover of it. Picturing grumpy Squidward doing the same thing every time SpongeBob bothered him is funny all on its own, but the team found that it looked too strange in motion to keep, so the idea was left on the cutting room floor, surfacing only now and then as a small joke, a wink at the real animal hiding under the cartoon. What makes the octopus secret so interesting is how cleanly it breaks a rule the show otherwise follows. Look at the other main characters, and the pattern jumps right out. SpongeBob is a sponge, and his name says sponge. Mr. Krabs is a crab, and his name says crab. Plankton is plankton, named for exactly what he is. Sandy is a squirrel and gets a squirrel sort of name. The show usually names its animals straight, telling the truth right there in the title. The pattern is so steady that it works almost like a promise. Hear a character's name and the animal is sitting right inside it. A crab named for crabs, a sponge named for sponges. It makes the whole world easy to read, even for the youngest kids watching, because the names do half the explaining on their own. Squidward breaks that promise in the quietest possible way, and because the break is small and the name still sounds sea-like, almost no one ever catches it. The single wrong label hides inside a long row of right ones, which is the best place for a wrong label to hide. The choice of an octopus over a squid fits everything known about the man who made the show. A person who had studied the ocean for years knew the difference between the two animals cold. He knew exactly what an octopus looked like. That big domed head, those 8 curling arms, the way it can change color and slide through a gap no wider than its own eye. When he reached for a creature to play the show's grumpy genius, he reached for the one with the largest, proudest looking head in the sea. The science and the joke are the same thing here. The animal that happens to carry a giant head got handed to the character who is sure he has a giant brain. Octopuses are among the cleverest creatures in the whole ocean, able to work out puzzles, open containers, and remember things for a surprisingly long time. They can change the color and even the texture of their skin in the space of a heartbeat. With no bones at all, they can pour their entire body through an opening barely larger than an eyeball. Some have even been seen carrying shells around to use as shelter, a little portable home for a clever, careful animal. A creature that smart and that strange makes a fitting secret identity for a character who believes, deep down, that he is the only truly sophisticated soul in Bikini Bottom. The difference between a squid and an octopus is easy to see once it gets pointed out. A squid has a longer, more bullet-shaped body and 10 limbs, with 2 of them stretched longer than the rest. An octopus has 8 arms and that famous round, soft, balloon-like head. Set a real squid beside a real octopus, and Squidward clearly takes after the octopus, head and all. The name is the only squid-like thing about him. Every other part of his design says octopus, loud and clear. When this fact began spreading widely, a great many people had the same reaction, a kind of cheerful outrage. Articles popped up with titles about childhoods being ruined, comment sections filled with stunned fans swearing they had always thought he was a squid. The whole thing turned into a popular little brain teaser, the sort of fact people love to spring on a friend just to watch their face change. It is harmless, it is true, and it flips a small piece of something deeply familiar on its head, which is exactly the kind of fact that travels fast and refuses to leave. This says something simple and a little funny about how names work in the first place. A name is a label, and most people trust the label without ever checking what is actually inside the box. The name said squid, so squid is what whole generations of viewers saw, even while an octopus stared back at them from the screen the entire time. Their eyes were being handed the truth, their ears were being handed the name, and the name won almost every time for almost everyone. This is one more piece of the same quiet trick that runs through the whole show. The opening hid the creator's mouth, the town hid a real place and a heavy history, and the grumpy neighbor, standing in plain sight in every episode, hides the wrong species right inside his name, with a body shaped from a real animal and a joke about his own ego built into his very skull. Once a person learns to look, the show keeps paying back the looking. None of it is by accident. The big head, the chosen animal, the dropped cloud of ink, even the slightly stuffy name, all of it points straight back to a maker who thought hard about small details that most viewers would never question. Squidward could have been any grouchy sea creature with any random name at all. Instead, he is a carefully chosen octopus, wearing a squid's name and a body trimmed down for the animators, every piece of him doing a little quiet work. And this is only the most famous example of a habit that runs through the entire cast. The bodies of these characters are not random shapes slapped onto funny voices. They are built, piece by piece, from a real knowledge of what lives in the sea, bent just far enough to be silly without ever losing the truth underneath. The man who drew them had spent real years among the actual animals, and that time shows up in 1,000 tiny choices: the shape of a head, the count of a set of arms, the grip of a suction cup on a kitchen floor. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. tremendously. The careful hand that picked the right animal for the right personality did not stop at the characters themselves. It reached into the places they live, too. Squidward's house, the strange tall shape he steps out of each morning to glare at his neighbors, is a copy of one of the oldest and most mysterious objects standing anywhere on the real Earth. A thing carved by human hands an ocean away and a very long time ago, for reasons people still argue about to this day. Section 6. The Ancient Face on Conch Street. 3 houses sit in a neat row on a street called Conch Street, and they could hardly be more different from one another. On one side stands a giant pineapple, bright and cheerful, where SpongeBob lives. On the other side sits a plain brown rock, low to the ground, with Patrick sleeping underneath it. And squeezed in the middle, towering over both of them, is a tall blue shape with a long face, a heavy brow, and a serious, almost grumpy expression carved into the front. That is where Squidward lives. Most people who watch the show have seen that house 1,000 times. SpongeBob and Patrick are forever bothering Squidward at his front door, and the camera rests on the strange blue tower in episode after episode. The door sits where a mouth would be. 2 windows sit where the eyes would be. In the daytime, the whole thing is a cool blue, and when night falls, it shifts to a darker, more purplish shade, the way pale stone might look under moonlight. From the street, it reads instantly as a face, a tall, calm face, quietly keeping watch over the row of homes. The house has carried the same address, 122 Conch Street, since the very first episode, parked in the same spot between its 2 neighbors for the entire run of the show. It is one of the most steady sights in the whole series, as unchanging as the real thing it happens to be copying, because that shape is not made up. Squidward's house is built to look like a real object, one of the most famous and most puzzling things on the entire planet. It is shaped like a moai, one of the giant stone heads of Easter Island. Easter Island is a small, lonely piece of land far out in the Pacific Ocean, off the coast of South America. It is one of the most cut-off inhabited places in the whole world. To reach it, a person has to travel a very long way over nothing but open water. The nearest mainland is thousands of miles off, and even the nearest other islands are far enough away that the place spent long stretches of its history completely on its own. The people who settled there, known as the Rapa Nui, built a whole world for themselves in that isolation, and the giant statues are the most stunning thing they left behind. Few places on Earth feel as far from everything else as that small, windswept island does. Long ago, the people of that island carved enormous statues out of stone. Nearly 1,000 of them are scattered across the island today. They are tall, taller than a grown person many times over, some as big as a small building, and each one weighs as much as several elephants. Every statue shares the same basic look: a long, solemn face, a heavy brow, a strong nose, a firm mouth, and a giant head set on top of a body. They have stood there for hundreds of years, gazing out across the land in long, silent rows, and they are some of the most recognizable carvings ever made by human hands. The statues were not dragged in from somewhere else. They were carved right there on the island, cut and shaped out of the soft volcanic stone in a kind of open-air workshop on the side of an old volcano. Hundreds were finished and raised up. Others were left half-carved, still lying in the rock where the work stopped, frozen partway through, as if the carvers had simply set down their tools one day and walked away. The whole island became a record of the effort, finished giants standing tall, and unfinished ones resting in the ground where they began. Many of the finished statues were lined up on long stone platforms, standing shoulder to shoulder with their backs to the sea, facing inward across the land toward the villages of the people who made them. Standing beneath one is a humbling thing. The smallest are taller than a grown adult, and the largest tower far overhead, heavy enough that moving even one seems impossible without modern machines. Row after row of these solemn stone giants once watched over the island, a silent crowd of faces carved to last. There are details on the real statues that make them stranger still. When they were new, many of the moai had eyes set into their faces, made from white coral with a dark stone center, which would have given each one a bright, almost lifelike stare. Some also wore a kind of large stone hat, carved from a different reddish rock and balanced carefully on the head. Standing finished and complete, with gleaming eyes and crowned in red, they would have looked far more alive and far more powerful than the bare gray faces most people picture today. Those eyes are part of why the statues feel like they are watching. A face with a real gaze does not simply sit there. It seems to follow, to notice, to hold a quiet opinion about whoever walks past. Squidward's house, with its 2 plain windows for eyes, keeps a small echo of that same feeling, a face on a quiet street that always seems to be looking back at the world in front of it. The statues were cut from volcanic rock, the kind of stone left behind by old volcanoes, which the island has in great supply. And here is where the show quietly proves it knew exactly what it was doing. An official guide to the show, printed back in 2004, spells the secret out on one of its pages. Squidward's house, it says, is built from volcanic rock, the very same material as the real statues it is copying. The people who made the show did not simply borrow the shape of a moai, they borrowed what it is made of as well, a detail almost no viewer would ever stop to check. There is a wonderful surprise hiding in the real statues, one that lines up with Squidward's house in a way that feels almost too perfect. For a long time, most people believed the moai were only heads, giant faces poking up out of the grassy ground with nothing beneath them. Then people dug down into the dirt around them and found something amazing. Many of the statues have whole bodies, long torsos and arms buried under the soil. The heads everyone could see were only the top part. The rest had slowly been covered over by centuries of dirt sliding down the hills. For generations, the picture most people carried in their heads was of bare faces alone, and the buried bodies came as a real shock when the digging finally revealed them. The lone head turned out to be only half the story, the visible half of something much larger sleeping under the grass. That is exactly what Squidward's house looks like, a great stone head rising up out of the ground with no body in sight. The cartoon home copies not only the look of a moai, but the strange way the real ones appear in the world, a giant face standing alone, the rest of it hidden below the surface. The real statues hold mysteries that people still argue about today. No one is completely sure how the islanders moved these massive stone giants from the place they were carved to the spots where they finally stood, sometimes miles away, without trucks or machines or any of the tools that would make it simple now. One popular idea is that they were stood upright and rocked from side to side with ropes so that they seemed to walk slowly across the land. People have even tested this in real life, using teams pulling ropes to tip a standing statue forward step by step, and it does seem possible that the giants were coaxed across the island this way, almost as if they strolled to their resting places. Even so, no one can say for certain that this is truly how it happened. The island keeps its answers. The stone faces give nothing away. Many believe the statues were raised to honor important ancestors, the great leaders and family elders of the past, turned into stone so they could keep watching over their people long after they were gone. If that is true, then the moai were a way of keeping the dead close, a face that stays behind when the person no longer can. The carvings still stand, centuries after the hands that shaped them turned to dust. Out of every shape a house could possibly take, this one suits Squidward perfectly. He is the character who believes he belongs to a grander, older, finer world than the silly town around him. He longs to be seen as a serious artist, a person of taste and importance. So the show gave him a home shaped like an ancient monument, a solemn stone face from a faraway land, parked right between a goofy pineapple and a plain rock. While his neighbors live in something fun and something simple, Squidward lives inside a giant, frowning relic, exactly the kind of grand and gloomy thing he imagines suits a man of his greatness. There is a logic to reaching for this particular monument and not some other one. The moai are among the most recognizable shapes in the world, instantly readable even to a small child who has never heard of Easter Island. They are also serious, old, and a little eerie, which is the exact mood Squidward carries with him everywhere he goes. A maker with an eye for art would know that one strange stone face dropped between a pineapple and a rock would say more about its owner than any amount of dialogue ever could. Even the look on the house matches the look on the man. The real moai wear heavy, serious, slightly stern expressions, brows low, mouth set firm. That is Squidward's face almost exactly. The permanent frown, the half-closed eyes, the air of someone who finds the whole world a little beneath him. He lives inside a giant version of his own grumpy expression. The house is, in a way, a portrait of its owner, carved hundreds of years before he was ever drawn. There is something a little sad in it too, once the connection settles. The real statues stand alone on a faraway island, weathered and silent, cut off from the rest of the world. Squidward, in his own way, is the loneliest figure in his town, certain he belongs somewhere finer, stuck instead between two neighbors he cannot escape. Giving him a home modeled on a lonely monument at the edge of the world fits the quiet ache the character carries underneath all of his complaining. The three houses on Conch Street, lined up together, quietly tell the story of the three characters inside them. The bright, sweet pineapple holds the bright, sweet sponge. The plain rock holds holds the simple, easygoing starfish who needs almost nothing at all to be happy, and the towering, ancient monument holds the one who thinks he is above it all. Nothing about the choices is random. Each home is a small clue about the person who lives there, sitting in the background of nearly every episode, doing its quiet work whether anyone notices it or not. This is the same careful habit showing up yet again. The creator and his team kept reaching out into the real world, pulling in real places and real objects, and tucking them into a cartoon about a talking sponge. A real ring of islands gave the town its name. A real sailor song gave the show its theme. And a real ancient wonder, carved by real people on a real lonely island, became the home of a grumpy octopus. The show is stitched through with pieces of the actual Earth, hidden so smoothly that most people never feel the seams. Squidward, in particular, turns out to be packed with buried truths. His body copies a real animal and quietly hides a joke about his ego. His name points at the wrong creature entirely, and his house copies one of the oldest mysteries on the planet, right down to the stone it is carved from. A single grumpy neighbor standing in the background of a children's cartoon carries more hidden history than almost anything else on the screen around him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every secret in the show is carved in stone or buried in old history though. Some of them are warm and personal, tucked into the voices themselves. One of the show's characters is a computer, married to the tiny villain who is forever scheming to steal a burger recipe. And that computer, quiet and deadpan and easy to overlook, carries two real love stories inside her at once. One belonging to the man who made the show, and one belonging to the very person who gives SpongeBob his voice. Section 7. The two love stories inside Karen. Inside the Chum Bucket, the gloomy little restaurant across the road from the Krusty Krab, there is a computer fixed to the wall. She has a flat screen for a face, a calm and steady voice, and a habit of saying exactly what she thinks. Her name is Karen, and she is married to Plankton, the tiny green villain who spends his whole life trying and failing to steal a single burger recipe. Karen is easy to overlook. She does not get the big laughs or the wild adventures. She mostly stays in one spot, helping Plankton with his endless schemes, pointing out the holes in his plans and sighing at him when those plans fall apart, which they always do. She is the calm, dry, clever half of the show's main pair of bad guys. And tucked inside this quiet computer character are two real love stories, both of them true, both of them belonging to real people who helped bring the show to life. Karen has been part of the show almost from the very start. She first appeared back in the summer of 1999, only a few months after the show began, in an early episode built around Plankton himself. From that point on, she became a fixture of the Chum Bucket, the screen on the wall who watches her husband chase the same impossible dream over and over without ever giving up on him. Plankton himself is one of the smallest characters in the entire show, a single green speck of a creature with one big eye, the kind of thing real fish swallow by the mouthful out in the actual ocean. He runs the Chum Bucket, a failing restaurant that almost never sees a single customer, and he pours every ounce of his energy into trying to steal the secret recipe that makes the Krusty Krab across the street so popular. Karen is his partner in all of it, the brains beside the schemer, the one who actually keeps things running while he rants and paces and plots. The first love story is hiding in her name. Karen the computer is named after a real person, Karen Hillenburg, the wife of Steven Hillenburg, the man who created the whole show. When he was building this world and needed a name for Plankton's computer partner, he reached for the name of the woman he loved and handed it to her. So every time someone says the name Karen on the show, they are speaking the name of the creator's own wife, a small private Valentine folded into a cartoon about a talking sponge. This fits the same gentle habit seen earlier in the story. The man who tucked his own mouth into the opening of every episode was exactly the kind of person who would slip his wife's name into the show too, quietly, without making any fuss about it. It is a love note written in a spot almost no one would ever think to read. Millions of people have said the name countless times, with no idea they were speaking a real woman's name, carried into the show by a husband who wanted a piece of her, living inside the thing he made. The second love story lives in the voice. Karen is voiced by an actor and comedian named Jill Talley, and Jill Talley is married in real life to Tom Kenny, the very man who gives SpongeBob his voice. The two of them have been married since the middle of the 1990s, after first meeting years before that while working together on a comedy show. So the voice of SpongeBob and the voice of Karen, the computer wife, belong to a real husband and wife, present together in the same underwater world, even though their characters almost never share a kind word. Once that fact is known, it adds a funny little twist to everything. Plankton spends every episode hating SpongeBob, scheming against him, treating him as the great enemy standing between himself and success. And in real life, the man behind SpongeBob is married to the woman behind Plankton's wife. Fans have had a great deal of fun with this over the years. The most common joke is a simple one. No wonder Plankton cannot stand SpongeBob. In the real world, SpongeBob went and married Karen. The two performers first crossed paths while working on the same comedy show in the early 1990s, well before the Sponge ever existed, and they married a few years after that. By the time SpongeBob arrived, they were already building a life together. The fact of their marriage tends to resurface online every so often, catching a fresh wave of fans by surprise. Each new group reacts the same way, with a laugh and a flood of jokes about the love triangle supposedly hiding behind the show's biggest rivalry. Jill Talley gives Karen a flat, dry, knowing way of speaking. The voice of someone who has heard every one of her husband's bad ideas 1,000 times over and is not impressed by a single one of them. That deadpan tone is a big part of why the character works so well. She is the straight one, the steady voice of reason standing right next to a tiny green ball of rage and ambition. Over the years, she grew important enough to the show that she came to be counted among its main cast. A character who began as a simple computer screen on a wall slowly turned into a real personality, in large part because of the calm, clever way she was voiced. Jill Talley brought a long history of comedy with her to the role. Before Karen, she had spent years learning to be funny on stage and in sketch shows, sharpening the kind of dry, perfectly timed delivery that can make a single bored sigh land as a laugh. That training is exactly what Karen needed. A computer with no body and almost no movement has to do all of her work with her voice alone, and Talley builds a whole personality out of nothing but flat, knowing tone. There is an extra wrinkle that makes the connection even richer. Tom Kenny does not only voice SpongeBob. Over the years, he has given his voice to a whole crowd of characters in the show, from the sleepy meows of the pet snail to the soft, dreamy voice that announces the passing of time between scenes. So the husband in this real marriage is not only the hero of the show, his voice is woven all through the town, turning up again and again in character after character, while his wife sits across the way as the calm computer in the villain's quiet, empty lair. There is something quietly sweet buried in this show because of all this. Plankton and Karen are the villains. They scheme, they fail, they bicker, they snap at each other when the plans collapse. And yet, underneath the plotting, they are also a married couple who stay together through every single defeat. He never wins. The chum bucket sits almost always empty. Their grand plans crumble week after week. Through all of it, the two of them stick by one another. In a strange way, the villains hold one of the steadiest marriages in the entire show, a tiny, angry creature and his calm computer wife, losing together year after year and never once walking away. Now and then the show even pauses to show that the two of them, for all their constant bickering, truly do care for each other, slipping a small moment of real tenderness into the middle of all the scheming. There is a small detail in the show that makes the real-life marriage behind the voices land even sweeter. While Plankton and SpongeBob are forever at odds, Karen and SpongeBob actually get along rather well. The computer wife finds the cheerful Sponge far easier to deal with than her own scheming husband does. So even inside the cartoon, away from Plankton's anger, the two characters, voiced by the real married couple, drift towards something warmer and friendlier, almost as if a bit of the off-screen bond keeps quietly slipping into the show. Naming a character after someone a person loves is one of the oldest and quietest ways a creator can leave a piece of their own heart inside their work. It does not change the plot. It does not show up on the screen as anything special at all. The name looks completely ordinary to everyone watching, but for the person who chose it and for the person it honors, it carries something private and warm. Hillenburg could have called that computer anything. He chose the name of his wife, and he kept it there for the entire life of the show, through hundreds of episodes and many years. There is a pattern worth noticing in where the creator chose to tuck the things he cared about. He did not put his wife's name on the hero, or on the cuddly best friend, or on the cheerful town itself. He placed it on the computer married to the villain. Perhaps that was simple chance. Perhaps a quiet, clever, level-headed character felt like the right home for it. Either way, the most personal name in the show ended up attached to one of its least expected characters, sitting calm and steady in the gloomiest corner of Bikini Bottom, keeping watch over a husband who never wins. It is a fitting hiding place for a love note, a spot only the most patient would ever think to check. The real marriage behind the voices adds a second warm layer, one the creator could never have have fully planned. When two people who love each other in real life voice characters in the same show, a little of that real bond tends to seep into the work, even when the characters themselves are not close. The same warmth that exists between Tom Kenny and Jill Talley away from the microphone lives quietly inside the cartoon, in the small fact that the bright sponge and the deadpan computer are played by a husband and wife who leave the recording booth and go home to the same house and the same family. It helps to remember that the people behind these voices have long careers and full lives of their own. Jill Talley spent years doing comedy before SpongeBob, working on stage and on sketch shows, building the sharp comic timing that makes Karen so funny in so few words. Tom Kenny has voiced a long list of beloved characters beyond the sponge. The two of them built a life together while also building parts of a show that millions of children would grow up loving. Their work and their marriage grew side by side, and a quiet trace of both ended up inside Bikini Bottom. This is the show hiding real things in plain sight once again, only this time the hidden thing is love. The town's name hid a real place and a heavy history. The opening hid the creator's own face, and the villain's computer wife hides two real relationships at once: the creator's marriage to the woman he named her after, and the marriage of the two performers who voiced the show's hero and his deadpan counterpart. The pattern holds steady. The surface is a silly computer in a villain's lair. Underneath sits something tender and true. It is also a gentle reminder that a cartoon is made by real people with real lives. The voices coming out of these characters belong to humans who fall in love, who marry, who name things after the people who matter most to them. The show feels like a sealed little world, tucked away safely under the sea, separate from everything above it. But it was built by a small group of people whose real lives leaked into the work in dozens of small ways, and Karen stands as one of the warmest examples of that quiet leaking. A love story wearing the face of a computer. So a character that most viewers barely think about turns out to be one of the most personal touches in the whole series. She is named for a real wife and voiced by a real wife, a double thread of love stitched into a screen on a wall in the saddest little restaurant in town. The angry green villain who runs that restaurant has, without most fans ever realizing it, been standing beside a quiet monument to two real marriages this entire time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The voices hide more than love, though. One of the most repeated sounds in the entire show, a short cry of pain that has echoed through hundreds of episodes and become a joke all its own, comes from the very same performer who voices Plankton. It belongs to a tiny background fish whose endless streak of terrible luck turned a single shouted line into one of the most beloved running gags the show has ever produced. Section 8. The fish who keeps getting hurt. Something blows up in Bikini Bottom. A boat crashes. A building topples over. A crowd panics and stampedes through the street. And in the middle of all the chaos, from somewhere off to the side, a voice cries out two short words. My leg! It happens again and again across the whole show. Anytime things go wrong in a big way, that same cry rings out. A quick yelp of pain from a fish nobody is really looking at. Most people who grew up with the show can hear those two words in their heads right now. Hardly any of them could say who is shouting, or why it keeps happening, or where the sound first came from. The voice belongs to a small brown fish named Fred. He is not a main character. He is one of the many background fish who fill out the crowds of Bikini Bottom, the kind of character who exists to stand in line at the Krusty Krab or fill a seat in a stadium. He has no big story of his own. What he has instead is the worst luck of anyone in the entire ocean. Whenever disaster strikes, Fred is somehow always close enough to get caught in it, and almost every time it is his leg that takes the damage. Bikini Bottom is full of fish like Fred. The show calls them background fish, the nameless extras who fill the streets and the restaurants and the stands at every big event. Most of them never get a single line. Fred started out as exactly that kind of nobody, one more face in a sea of faces. Over the years though, the show began handing him a little more. A line here, a moment there, until this random background fish had quietly become one of the most recognizable faces in the whole crowd, all on the strength of his terrible luck. The cry goes all the way back to the early days of the show, to the very first season. From those early episodes onward, the same short shout kept turning up whenever something went wrong, and over time, it became one of the most familiar sounds in the entire series. It is the kind of thing that sneaks up on a person. No single episode makes a big deal of it, but it happens so often across so many years that it quietly works its way into the memory of everyone who watches. Here's part of what makes it work. The cry is a stock sound, a single recorded clip that gets dropped into the show show over and over, instead of being acted out fresh each time. The same little burst of sound, the same voice, the same 2 words, played again whenever the moment calls for it. This is an old trick in movies and television. There's a famous scream, nicknamed the Wilhelm scream, that has been quietly reused in hundreds of films for decades. It got its odd name from a character in an old movie who let out the yell, and sound crews found the recording so handy that they kept slipping it into film after film as a private little joke among themselves. Whole generations of movies share that one borrowed scream. There's also a falling yell that the cartoon character Goofy makes, reused the very same way. The "my leg" cry belongs to that same family, one good recording built to be used again and again. And the voice behind that little cry has a familiar owner. It comes from a man named Doug Lawrence, often known simply as Mr. Lawrence, who has been part of the show for years as both a writer and a performer. He is the same man who voices Plankton, the tiny green villain from the last part of the story. So the deep, scheming voice of the show's main bad guy and the small, pained yelp of the unluckiest fish in town come from the very same person. One performer, 2 completely different sounds, both of them woven through hundreds of episodes. The man behind the cry is one of the most important people working on the show that most fans could not name. He writes episodes. He performs many voices. He has helped shape the series for a very long time, sitting quietly behind the scenes while his work plays out front and center. The little "my leg" shout is only one of countless marks he has left on the show. The kind of small touch a longtime crew member sprinkles in over years and years of steady work. The thing that turns "my leg" into more than a plain sound effect is repetition. A single fish getting hurt is not really a joke, but a fish who gets hurt every time in every disaster, no matter what is happening around him, slowly becomes funnier and funnier. The audience starts to expect it. A building begins to topple, and before the crash even lands, part of the brain is already waiting for that little voice. When it comes, it pays off the wait. The comedy is built out of pure patience, a joke that grows stronger the longer the show keeps telling it. Part of why the gag has lasted so long is that it asks almost nothing of the audience. There is no setup to remember, no story to follow, no clever wordplay to catch. Something breaks, a voice yelps, and the joke is finished in less than a second. A gag that simple can be dropped into almost any scene without slowing it down, which is exactly why the show could keep using it for decades without it ever wearing out its welcome. There is a special comfort in a joke like this for people who watch a show for years. A running gag becomes a kind of friend. It shows up unannounced, does its familiar little trick, and disappears again. And every time it returns, it carries the warm weight of every other time it has happened. Longtime viewers do not only laugh at the cry, they recognize it, the way a person recognizes an old song. And that flash of recognition is its own small pleasure, layered right on top of the joke itself. Over the years, the show began playing with the gag in clever ways. Sometimes Fred cries about a different body part, trading the leg for his eyes, or his nails, or something else, depending on what kind of trouble has found him. In the first big movie, when a character yanks a bag off the head of an angry sea king and reveals that he is bald, the crowd panics, and Fred is right there yelling about his eyes. The show learned that the audience knew the gag so well that it could bend it, twist it, and surprise people with it, all while keeping the heart of the joke exactly the same. Fred even picked up a few other lines over the years, beyond his famous cry. He has a way of speaking that fans came to know, and the couple of his other shouts have become small jokes of their own. Yet nothing ever topped the original. The leg remained his calling card, the thing he would always be remembered for, no matter what else the show let him say. The gag grew so beloved that the show eventually gave Fred his own episode. By the time that happened, the joke had been running for the better part of 20 years. In that episode, his leg finally heals up after all that time, and SpongeBob becomes determined to keep it safe from harm, fussing over it as if it were made of glass. The whole story is one long love letter to a gag the audience had been enjoying for 2 decades, turning years of small background pain into a full plot of its own. A fish who had spent his life getting hurt off to the side finally took center stage. The sound even traveled beyond the show itself. Like other famous reused sounds, that little cry of "my leg" has slipped into a few other cartoons here and there, a small inside joke for anyone with sharp ears. A sound born in Bikini Bottom went wandering off into other shows, the way these well-worn clips tend to do once they become known enough. There is something quietly wonderful about how all of this happened. Fred was never meant to be important. He was filler, a face in the crowd, the kind of character a show makes by the dozen and never thinks about about again. He had no plan to become famous, no big arc, no grand purpose. He became one of the most recognizable parts of the entire show purely by being in the wrong place at the wrong time over and over for years on end. Fame found him by accident through repetition and bad luck, which is a very strange and very funny way to matter. The unluckiest fish in the sea turned out to be one of the luckiest characters the show ever made, remembered and quoted long after fancier characters faded from memory. There is even a gentle kindness in giving the background a name and a voice at all. In most shows, the fish in the crowd stay forever nameless, mattering to no one. This show took one of those nameless extras and, almost by accident, made him beloved. People who could not name a single other background fish know Fred. They quote him, they wait for him. A character built to be ignored ended up earning real affection, which says something quietly sweet about a show that never treated even its smallest pieces as throwaway. It also shows how much care can hide inside the tiniest parts of a show. A single sound, just 2 shouted words, was recorded once and then placed with real timing into scene after scene, always landing at the right moment to make a crash a little funnier. The people making the show could have let their explosions and disasters pass by in silence. Instead, they kept reaching for that one little voice, trusting that the audience would love it a bit more each time. The smallest sound in the show turned out to be one of its most carefully used. This is one more thread leading back to the same small group of people who built the show with so much hidden care. The man behind that tiny cry is the same one behind the show's main villain, and the same one who, years later, would confirm the dark secret buried in the town's very name. A single performer left fingerprints all across the series, in the loudest schemes and the smallest yelps and the deepest secrets. The show is full of these quiet overlaps, the same hands and voices turning up again and again in places most viewers never stop to connect. On the surface, my leg is just a silly noise, a throwaway gag for a quick laugh during a crash. Underneath it sits a real performer doing double duty, an old trick of reused sound borrowed from the movies, and an accidental star who rose up out of the background through nothing but repetition. Even the show's dumbest little joke turns out to have layers for anyone who bothers to look. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cleverness, though, is not only hiding in the sounds and the names and the people behind the voices. Some of it is buried inside the jokes themselves. All through the show, in gags that millions of people laugh at without a second thought, there are real facts about the ocean tucked quietly underneath. True science, folded into silliness so smoothly that the audience has been learning about the sea this whole time without ever once realizing it. Section 9. The Hidden Science Lessons. On its surface, SpongeBob looks like pure nonsense. A sponge wears pants and flips burgers. A starfish lives under a rock. A squirrel breathes underwater. None of it seems to follow any rules at all. It plays like a world dreamed up only for laughs, with no thought given to whether a single piece of it makes real sense. The thing is, the man who built that world spent years studying the real ocean. He had a degree in sea life, and before he ever made a cartoon, he taught children about ocean animals for a living, standing over tide pools and pointing out the small creatures most people walk right past. When he finally made his silly show, the teacher in him never switched off. He could not help slipping real science into it, tucking true facts about the sea underneath the jokes, hidden so smoothly that almost no one ever notices they are quietly learning something. Start with SpongeBob's home. He lives inside a giant pineapple, which seems like a random, goofy choice for an undersea house. There is a real reason it fits, though. Out in the actual ocean, there is a kind of sea sponge known as the pineapple sponge. So a sponge living in a pineapple is a small private joke for anyone who knows their sea life, a nod to a real creature that shares the name. The home and the resident match in a way most viewers never catch. SpongeBob himself behaves like a real sponge in ways that are easy to miss. A real sponge is one of the simplest animals alive. It has no brain, no heart, and no bones. It spends its life fixed in one spot, pulling seawater through its body and catching tiny bits of food as the water passes through. In the show, SpongeBob can be torn, squished, split, and stretched, and he always bounces right back, good as new. That is not only cartoon magic. Real sponges are famously tough in exactly this way. A real sponge can be broken into pieces and simply grow back, and it can even make a whole new sponge by sprouting one off of its own body. SpongeBob surviving things that would end any other character is, underneath the silliness, a true fact about how sponges actually live. His best friend friend hides a matching secret. Patrick is a starfish, and real starfish, for all their slow creeping, have no brain at all. They get by without one, spreading out across the ocean floor and feeling their way through life with no thinking part to guide them. Patrick, gentle and cheerful, and famously not the sharpest mind in town, is a near-perfect cartoon of that real fact. Two best friends, a sponge and a starfish, both based on real animals that get along just fine without a brain, both written as the two simplest, happiest souls in the show. There is even a quieter, slightly darker truth resting in SpongeBob's world. Out in the real sea, a sponge is not safe from everything. Certain young flatfish actually eat sponges as part of their diet, so a creature like SpongeBob would have real enemies waiting down there. A grim fact sitting under all the cheerfulness. True to the ocean, even when the show would rather not dwell on it. Then there is Plankton. His very name is a science lesson on its own. Out in the real sea, plankton are the tiny drifting specks of life that float through the water, so small that most cannot be seen alone, yet so plentiful that enormous whales survive by swallowing them in giant mouthfuls. They sit at the very bottom of the ocean food chain, the smallest and most overlooked life in the sea. Naming the show's tiniest, most ignored, most overlooked villain after the smallest life in the ocean is a perfect, quiet joke. The character with the biggest dreams carries the name of the smallest thing in the water. Plankton is also drawn as one very particular kind of tiny creature, with a single eye sitting right in the middle of his head. That single centered eye is exactly how the real creature he is based on looks. The show even leaned into this once, putting him in a shirt that proudly announces the exact kind of creature he is. A wink for anyone who knows what the name means. There is a deeper joke buried in him still. The real creature he is modeled on often gets by in life by taking from others, living off bigger animals instead of making its own way. And what does Plankton do in every single episode? He tries to steal. He spends his entire life scheming to take the secret recipe from the bigger, more successful restaurant across the street. His whole personality, the endless thieving, quietly matches the real habits of the creature he was built from. One episode hides an even cleverer science joke. In it, Plankton sits down to eat a meal made entirely of light, a glowing dinner with no real food in it at all. On the surface, it is an absurd gag. Underneath, it is exactly right. The tiny drifting creatures that share Plankton's name out in the real ocean often make their own food directly from sunlight, turning light into energy in order to live. So feeding Plankton a dinner made of light is not random at all. It is a sly joke that only fully lands for someone who knows how those real creatures actually eat. Sandy might be the clearest example of all. She is a squirrel who lives at the bottom of the ocean, which sounds impossible, and the show knows it. Squirrels breathe air. They cannot breathe water the way fish do. So the show gives Sandy a glass dome to live in, filled with air, and a special suit and helmet whenever she steps outside into the water. The cartoon went out of its way to solve a real problem. A land animal cannot simply live underwater, so the show built her the gear she would actually need to survive down there. The joke runs in both directions, which is the best part. When the sea creatures visit Sandy inside her air-filled dome, the whole thing flips. Now they are the ones who cannot breathe, because they need water and there is only air. So they have to wear little helmets full of water just to walk around in her house. The show thought through both sides of the problem, the land animal in the sea and the sea animals on the land, and made the science work for each of them. Even small background characters carry hidden science. In one episode, there is a giant king jellyfish, and he is handed a grand, important sounding name. That name turns out to be built from two real pieces. One part is the actual name that scientists use for the larger family of animals that real jellyfish belong to. The other part is the old word for king, the very same word hiding inside the name of a certain famous dinosaur. So the king jellyfish is, quite literally and quite accurately, named the king of the jellyfish family in proper old-fashioned style. The voice that narrates the show holds a hidden tribute too. Every so often, a calm voice with a French accent speaks over the action, announcing how much time has passed or setting up the next scene. That voice is a nod to a real and famous ocean explorer, a Frenchman who spent his life diving the seas and showing the world what lived beneath the surface, often on television, often in a little red cap. Hillenburg, who loved the ocean with his whole heart, tipped his hat to one of the great real-life ocean adventurers by giving his show a narrator who sounds just like him. The show even reaches for animals most people have never heard of. In one episode, SpongeBob adopts what looks like a cute little bunny. It seems like a pure invention, a fluffy rabbit dropped into the sea for laughs. But there is a real creature called the sea bunny, a tiny, soft sea slug that genuinely looks like a small white rabbit, complete with what appear to be little ears. Once again, a thing that seems made up turns out to be real, pulled straight from the strange truth of the ocean. The same holds for some of the show's monsters. When a giant, fearsome sea snail threatens the town in one story, it is leaning on a real truth as well. Real sea snails of that kind are hunters rather than gentle grazers, and some grow to surprising sizes while feeding on crabs and other sea creatures. A scary giant snail turns out to be closer to the real ocean than a person might guess. The bond between the show and the real sea got a perfect, almost unbelievable moment a few years ago. Scientists exploring the deep ocean floor with a camera came across a bright yellow sponge sitting right next to a pink starfish. The two of them, side by side on the seabed, looked so much like SpongeBob and Patrick that a real scientist studying the footage said so right out loud, comparing them to the cartoon friends. The real ocean had, entirely by chance, produced a living picture of the two best pals. Life had quietly copied the cartoon, though it is just as fair to say the cartoon had been copying life all along. What makes all of this special is how it works on two levels at the very same time. A small child watching can laugh at a sponge in a pineapple or a squirrel in a helmet without knowing a single fact about the ocean. The jokes are complete and funny all on their own. But for anyone who knows the real science, a second layer quietly opens up, a cleverer joke hiding underneath the obvious one. The show rewards knowledge without ever demanding it, handing a few extra little gifts to whoever happens to know more about the sea. There is real generosity in building a show this way. None of the hidden science is needed for the jokes to work. A lazier creator could have skipped all of it and lost nothing on the surface. Hillenburg put it in anyway, layer after layer, for the small number of people who would ever notice, and for the simple joy of getting it right. The extra effort is invisible to almost everyone, which makes it feel less like showing off and more like a quiet act of love for the subject. This circles all the way back to where the whole story began. The show started as a teaching tool, a comic made by a science educator to help children care about ocean animals. He never set out to make a lesson. He wanted to make something funny, yet the teacher in him simply would not switch off. The real knowledge kept leaking into the work, scene after scene, until the silly cartoon was quietly doing the very thing its creator once did for a paycheck, making children a little more curious about the sea without a single one of them ever noticing the lesson tucked inside the laugh. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Most of the show's secrets are things that were carefully placed in, hidden by being added, buried in jokes and names and designs for sharp-eyed fans to dig up and find. There is one last kind of secret though, and it works the exact opposite way. Some pieces of the show were hidden by being taken out. Certain episodes pulled from the air and locked away, edited or erased so completely that most fans alive today have never been able to see them at all. Section 10. The episodes quietly locked away. A show that runs for more than 20 years does not stay frozen. The world around it changes. What seems perfectly fine to put on television in one year can feel wrong a decade later, and a show that began back in 1999 has lived through enormous shifts in what people believe is okay to show to children. Most of the time, a long-running show simply keeps rolling forward and never looks back. Now and then, though, it reaches into its own past and quietly removes something. Most of the secrets in this show were hidden by being added, tucked in for sharp-eyed fans to dig up and find. This last kind of secret works the other way around. These are pieces that were hidden by being taken away. Episodes and scenes pulled from the air, locked up or trimmed down until they became hard or even impossible to see. The most famous example is an episode from the show's third season called Midlife Crustacean. It first aired back in 2003. In it, Mr. Krabs is feeling old and worn out, stuck in a low and gloomy mood, and SpongeBob and Patrick decide to lift his spirits by taking him out for a wild night meant to make him feel young again. For a long time, it played like any other episode in the rotation, popping up in reruns alongside everything else. Then, quietly, it stopped. The episode has not aired on the network since 2018, and it was pulled from the main places where people stream the show online, vanishing from services where every other episode still sits ready to watch. For a show this huge and this widely available, having a single episode simply missing is strange and easy to notice once a person knows to look for it. The reason came down to one scene near the end of the story. The wild night out leads the three of them to sneak into a stranger's house and take a woman's underwear, a moment the episode plays for a quick laugh. It turns out the house belongs belongs to Mr. Krabs' own mother, who catches them in the act and sends her grown son off to bed like a child. When the company that owns the show looked back over its older episodes years later, it decided that this part was not right for the young audience the show is mostly made for. The official word was that the episode had been taken out of rotation after a review found that some of its story was not appropriate for kids, so it was set aside, kept off the air, and off the main streaming services, even while it stayed a favorite among plenty of longtime fans who had grown up with it. Copies still exist on certain older home video collections, but the easy, everyday way of watching it is simply gone. What surprised many fans is that the episode had always been fairly well liked. It was never seen as one of the show's weak or forgettable entries. It had jokes that people quoted and remembered fondly for years afterward. Its quiet removal landed right around a wider moment when many companies began looking back through their older shows and films with sharper, more careful eyes, deciding that a few things which once slipped by without comment no longer belonged. This show was simply one among many getting a second, stricter look at its own past. A second episode disappeared for a completely different reason, one tied to the real world in a way nobody making it could have planned. Late in the show's long run, there is an episode called Quarantined Crab. In it, a health inspector arrives at the Krusty Krab and announces that someone inside has caught a sickness, a made-up illness called the clam flu. To keep it from spreading, every customer and worker in the restaurant is locked inside together and ordered to stay put. Panic sets in. The trapped crowd begins to turn on one another, growing frightened and suspicious as the doors stay shut around them. When that episode was made, it was simply a goofy story about a restaurant full of nervous fish. Then, the real world shifted underneath it. A real sickness swept across the entire planet, and all at once, a cartoon about people locked inside a building during an outbreak, turning on each other in fear, hit far too close to something that millions of families were actually living through at that very moment. The show held the episode back, deciding it was the wrong thing to put on screens, while so many real people were going through the real version of it. A silly story became impossible to air, not through any fault of its own, but because life had caught up to it in a painful and unlucky way. That episode sits in an odd kind of limbo now. It was finished and ready, a complete piece of work that almost no one was ever allowed to properly see. Versions of it have quietly drifted around online, in one language or another, found by curious fans hunting for the very episode the show decided to hide. Whether it will ever air the normal way, or simply stay locked in the vault forever, is still an open question. It exists, fully made, waiting in the dark for a moment that may never come. There is also a famous case where only a piece of an episode vanished, rather than the whole thing. One much-loved episode, called Just One Bite, first aired with a short scene that the show later quietly cut out. In that scene, Squidward, sneaking around the restaurant late at night, goes to dark and dangerous lengths involving fire to get what he is after. Some parents complained about it not long after the episode first aired, back in the early 2000s, so the scene was trimmed away and the longer version stopped turning up on television. For many years now, the only version shown has been the shortened one. The missing piece survives mostly in old recordings that fans happened to make when it first played, before anyone knew it would be taken out. The strange part is that Just One Bite, taken as a whole, is often named among the funniest episodes the show ever produced. The cutscene did nothing to dim the love for it. If anything, the missing piece only made the episode more talked about, with fans trading the old uncut version like a small lost treasure, and newcomers learning with surprise that the version they grew up watching had quietly been missing a few seconds the entire time. What makes all of this so interesting is that none of these vanished pieces are truly gone. People who grew up taping shows at home, or who bought the episodes on disc back when they were freely sold, still hold copies of the original versions, so the removed scenes and the pulled episodes live on, tucked away in attics and on old hard drives and in quiet corners of the internet, passed carefully from one fan to the next. A thing can be taken off the air, pulled from the stores, and lifted off every streaming service, and still flatly refuse to disappear, kept alive by the people who loved it enough to remember. There is a funny truth hidden in that. Taking something away often makes people want it more. An episode that played quietly for years, barely remarked upon, suddenly becomes a treasure the moment it is locked up. Fans who might never have given it a second thought go hunting for it, precisely because it is hard to find. The act of hiding a thing can shine a brighter light on it than leaving it alone ever would. What all of this really shows is a strange thing that happens to anything which lasts long enough. A show that runs for decades ends up outliving the rules it was made under. The people making it in the early years held one idea of what was fine to show. The people in charge many years later held a different one, shaped by a changed and more careful world. When those two ideas bump against each other, the older work can suddenly look out of place in the present, even though not a single frame of it has changed. The episode is exactly the same as it always was. The world watching it is the thing that moved. This happens to far more than one cartoon. Plenty of old shows and films, beloved in their day, have had moments quietly trimmed or whole entries pulled as the years rolled on and the world's sense of what belongs on a children's screen kept shifting. A long life almost guarantees it. Anything that stays popular long enough will eventually carry a few pieces that the present would rather not show, simply because they were made in a different time by people thinking different thoughts. There is also a tension built into this show from the very beginning. It was made for children, yet it was always a little bit for grown-ups too, slipping in jokes and moments aimed right over the heads of the youngest viewers. That balance is a big part of why so many adults still love it today. It also means the show sometimes wandered into territory that, looking back with fresh eyes, sat uneasily inside something mostly meant for kids. The pulled episodes are the spots where that careful balance tipped a little too far in one direction, and where a later, more cautious eye decided to step in and pull it back. In the end, a show loved by everyone has to keep deciding, again and again, who it is truly for. When the answer lands on the children first, a few of the grown-up edges get sanded down, even years after the fact. This is the mirror image of everything that came before. All through the show, real things were hidden by being placed in the creator's own mouth, his wife's name, true ocean science, and a real and terrible piece of history, all of it folded gently into the work. These last secrets were hidden the opposite way, by being pulled back out. Both kinds are the very same show, carrying things just beneath its surface, things most viewers never see. One kind was tucked in with love and left there to be found. The other was taken away out of worry and meant to be quietly forgotten. There is something almost haunting about a missing piece of a thing this famous. Billions of people have seen this show. It plays in nearly every country on Earth, on every kind of screen, in dozens of languages. And yet, somewhere inside that enormous, everywhere-at-once cartoon, a few small pieces have been quietly walled off. Episodes a person cannot simply call up and watch. A scene that still exists, but has been pushed just out of reach. A show that feels completely open and endlessly available turns out to have a few locked doors hidden along its hallways. 10 secrets then, hidden in 10 different ways, scattered all through a cartoon about a sponge who lives in a pineapple. Some were carefully added, and some were carefully removed. Some are funny, some are sweet, one is genuinely sad, and a few are stranger than anything the show ever put on purpose. On their own, each one is just a single odd fact, a fun thing to know. Put together though, they begin to point at something much larger, a single, quiet truth about why this silly little show grew into one of the most beloved things ever made, and why it has held on to that love for so very long. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.